Well, lovely to see you all here tonight. Thank you very much for coming. And I also want to welcome Colleen here tonight too. At last you're here, it's been third time lucky, I think. It has taken 3 dates. Yeah. Just a bit of a pre-run. A group of us actually went and heard something of this talk back in November, back in the days before COVID. and we were very taken with this talk, and we really appreciated Colleen's honesty and always her Christian perspective as she speaks. And we came away talking in the car saying, wouldn't this be good if Colleen could come to us here at Menai? So third time lucky, we have you. So we really appreciate you coming. So you would have read from your invitation the experience that Colleen is involved with at Maryland's Counselling Centre. She comes to us as a clinical psychologist and a family therapist who has been working in the counselling world for over 30 years. It's not just her professionalism and her experience as a psychologist that she brings to us tonight, but I think it's also her personal experience of walking with our Lord Jesus for many years and holding tight with him in times of wanting to trust him more and getting to know him in deeper ways. And so Colleen brings that to us here tonight as well, plus her professionalism and her knowledge in the psychology world. So I thank you so much for coming, and I think I might pray before we start. Lord Jesus, we thank you so much that we're able to meet here tonight. We thank you, Father, for how much we've learned in the last few months about social distancing and hygiene and the ability to be able to meet and to feel safe as best we can. Father, we do ask that you do keep us safe here tonight. Help us to be very considerate of one another, and help us, Lord God, to be able to listen to you as well as Colleen speaks. And we ask, Lord God, that you just empower her and give her your words, and that, Father, that we will go away tonight, Father, gaining some more knowledge about us as human beings, our physiology, but also, Father, having a real glimpse of your love and kindness and care in times of grief and loss. So, Father, we thank you for who you are in our lives, and especially in Colleen's. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you. You missed a spot? No.
Always do.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. What an interesting topic that we've got, given what's happening in the world with all of the changes that are happening, and we're experiencing lots of loss. It's like there's a collective grief that's starting to envelop the world just from so much loss. We're losing predictability. We're losing the sense of the way the world should be. We feel like we're losing control. Not that we ever really had that. So that's kind of happening at the moment. That's not the topic of the talk, but it's just kind of happened incidentally. One of the things that's really important, because it's just a short snapshot, and I'm really aware we might press buttons. So if anybody does, feel that you're a little bit upset, that's absolutely fine if you need to step out for a bit or not. I'm hoping to finish around 8:30 so that if anyone does have a question or just want to talk about something, I should be around for about half an hour if that's helpful. You might all want to run out the door the second I finish, and that's okay too. Okay, one thing that we know is death is inevitable. Every one of us here is going to die. Everybody that we know is going to die. It's pre-programmed in Psalm 139, every day of our life, written in God's book before one of them came to be. My husband passed away just over 3 years ago, and I have absolute certainty that he was always going to die on that day. And God already knew that. It's just that I didn't know that. And it took me quite a while to catch up, and I'm still catching up with that. I'm still catching up with that reality. We'd like grief to be really manageable, but it's messy. It's called an a-theoretical model because I'm going to talk about 4 different approaches to working with grief. The problem is they're all really clunky. I think that it's better to approach grief from the perspective of one size fits one. So we're each going to find our way to grieve differently. In the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it says that complicated grief, you can be diagnosed with that if you're still struggling 6 months after the death. That's just ridiculous. That's not complicated grief. Typically, it's about 1 to 2 years until you have a real sense of self-righting. It took me 3, and that's okay. I don't think I'm crazy. It just takes the time that it takes for us. The 3 most profound griefs that really can linger and bite us, the death of a child is probably the number 1. The death of an intimate long-term partner, that's my husband, we were together for nearly 40 years, or a murder or a suicide. They're kind of the 3. So we need to have a lot of grace and understanding if it's happening in our life or people that we know. You know, some people are going to struggle for quite a while, and that's okay. You know, grief is the product of loving somebody and of being committed and having your life really entwined with theirs, and to suddenly lose that, it can have a big impact on us. So we'd like grief to be straightforward. I better turn this on. That's the way we'd like grief to be. Let's just have this simple way to solve it. It isn't like that. It's messy and clunky, and we go forwards and we go backwards, and it bites us. And one of the most difficult things that I had after my mother died, not so much with my husband, when she died, there was quite a few weeks, if not months, where I'd wake up in the morning kind of with no sense of my mum being dead, and then suddenly it would hit me like a few seconds after waking up, and it was like my mother died all over again. Just that profound wave of, oh, my mother's dead. So it's going to impact us differently, and that can be pretty scary. It can be pretty difficult for us. Okay, let's have a look then. I was going to ask everyone, what sort of examples of grief have we been experiencing personally, like what brings us here? But I'm not going to do that because I don't want your germs to spread around the room. Instead, we'll have a look at this list. And this is just some examples. It's definitely not definitive because I haven't got COVID grief in there, but that's kind of a thing. It fits into a few of them. So the most obvious one, or the one that we understand straight away, is the death of a significant other. So that's a mother, a father, a husband, a wife, a child, a cousin, a sister. It's somebody that they're significant in our life, that there's lots of connection. Could be a best friend, someone we've grown up with. So that's probably the main one that really gets the traction, and a lot of the research and a lot of the articles are written around that stuff. Now, it's in that category that most of us are going to struggle, and that's where complicated grief can bite us. Now, complicated grief, which is where we're stuck and we're not recovering, that only affects, I don't know how they get the statistics, about 93%, about 7% of us, 93% of us are going to travel the road of grief in a very healthy way. It just hurts. It's just messy. It's not fun. It's not pleasant. It's painful. It's wretched. And so that's normal. And so it's riding that wave and being able to walk with people in their wretchedness. They won't be wretched all the time, but it's not pleasant, it's not fun. And sometimes it's not fun to be around people who are grieving because they're not fun. Second one is the loss of part of self. Now, we can lose vision, we can lose hearing, we can lose an arm or a leg, we lose a physical part of who we are, the ability to walk. Can have a really big impact for people. One of the girls in my practice she had a half a foot amputated, then she had half a leg amputated, now she's had the whole leg amputated. And just adjusting to those layers of loss, it isn't just losing that bit of your body, it's losing everything that goes with that. She can't walk now, she can't run, the prosthetic wouldn't take, she's in a wheelchair, and the layers go on. So it isn't just the one event that if only it was just one thing. It never is just one thing. All right, we'll move quickly through this. The loss of an external object, that was big last Christmas. I went to some regional areas and gave some talks about the impact of loss of livelihood, the impact of the fires, of floods, of farms collapsing, bankruptcy. That's huge. You know, you could have your car stolen, somebody breaks into your house. You know, losing things can have a really big impact on our life. Developmental losses, sorry about fiddling with this. Developmental losses are around women losing the ability to have children, menopause, finishing high school, retiring. You know, the changes that happen, even coming to terms with just the ageing process. I've seen quite a few people who come to counselling because they're not coping with what their body's doing and what their brain's doing or not doing. So that developmental loss is real. We want to be able to age well because we can't avoid it. Fantasy loss is another one I see a lot of people for the babies they should have had, for the relationships they should have had, particularly people who are single, people who have never got the career they wanted, didn't get the job, life just didn't work out the way they wanted it. And that's quite big when I've got women in their 40s coming into therapy because they don't have a partner and recognising that they'll probably now never have children as well. And they're kind of a bit invisible because we'll put on our smiley face when we're at church or out in the community, but the heartache is real. It's very big. So the anticipatory loss, well, there's a lot of COVID in that. So COVID fits partly in here, but it's particularly people who are facing their own death, people who are facing the fact that they're going to be deported, they're facing retirement. So it's, you know, something is coming. Some of you know The 5 Stages of Death by Kubler-Ross. Her 5 stages are about anticipatory grief. They were written specifically for people who are facing their own death and what the stages they go through as they're coming to terms with the fact that they're going to pass away. Sorry, this is very annoying. Just ignore it. The disenfranchised grief, this one's tricky. It's when somebody might have a child die from a drug overdose, or their child goes to jail, or they're in another country and they're executed, or someone's having an affair and it's their secret lover dies and you can't tell anyone, or there's a suicide and that's too much shame to talk to people about. So it's disenfranchised, you're not getting the support because it's kind of not socially sanctioned. There's this embarrassment about this death that's happened. So we bury it. And we're not good at telling people about it, and so we're not good at getting support for that either. So we really need to lay down our judgment stick if we know somebody whose a child has overdosed or jail or whatever the issues might be, because that grief is real, and it's hard to do grief isolated and on your own. The chronic sorrow is particularly if somebody gives birth to a child with a disability. That's where chronic sorrow first got its name in the 1960s. Originally, families, particularly mothers who hadn't come to terms with the disabilities of their child, were treated as if they had some sort of hysterical reaction formation, that they had mental illness. Now it's been recognised that it's a healthy, normal reaction. Chronic sorrow is, my child is born with a disability and I have to adjust to the loss of the perfect child. Now as a toddler, I'm seeing all of the other toddlers who are crawling and starting to talk and walk, and my child is still in a vegetative state in the cot. Now I'm looking at other children in the neighbourhood who are starting to go to school, and my child can get out if I take them in the wheelchair. So the chronic sorrow is something that it doesn't stop. It keeps on going while I'm caring for this child. And it just cascades multiple losses. Now, often people who are raising a child with a disability, you don't see the stress and the strain. You don't see the ache that's going on for them. So chronic sorrow is very big, and in Australia, most families, I think it's in the 80% of kids with disabilities are cared for in their own homes, and particularly the mums carry the lion's share of that. So just being aware of the cost and the load, the emotional strain and burden. People will often smile, but underneath it can be really tough. And then the frozen or ambiguous loss. This is COVID, because it's a loss that's we're all still here, COVID's still happening, but there's loss all around us. The typical one of that is where people are divorced or separated, so the relationship's over, but you have to stay in touch for the sake of the kids. So the relationship might be dead, but it's still alive, and so you have to keep going through that grief of that reconnecting and then saying goodbye. And so it's ambiguous. It's a loss, but it isn't. And I think COVID's a little bit like that as well, because there's no kind of end. We haven't hit the end. Usually when there's a loss or a death, it's a thing that happened. With this, it's not. Okay, that kind of is an overview of some of the sorts of loss that we can experience. It could be one of the objects that we lose could be loss of a neighbourhood when there's development that comes through. It could be moving to another country and losing our home country and our family and friends. So there's lots and lots of other examples, and it's tuning in to it's normal when people are struggling with some of these losses. We're going to talk about some heavy stuff. I'm going to talk to you about, we're going to focus really a lot around death. So we're going to have a gloomy talk tonight. It's going to be pretty heavy. So I thought I'm going to show you a funny clip that talks about loss related to aging. And I'm allowed to say that because I'm not really getting old, but sort of. I'll own a little bit. So it's just a silly clip to add some lightness to this topic, and then we're going to move on to some darker stuff. So this is about some of the losses that can happen with aging.
I got to thinking, what would it be like if a guy didn't really know the girl he was marrying, you know? Yeah. And goes like this, we got married last Friday. My girl was right there beside me. Our friends were all gone. We were alone, side by side. We were so happily wed when she got ready for bed then. Her teeth and her hair she placed in a chair, side by side. One glass eye so tiny, one hearing aid so small. Then she took one leg off and placed on the chair by the wall. I stood there broken-hearted. Most of my girl had departed. I slept on the chair. There was more of her there. By side.
The lovely Christian man, I forget his name off the top of my head. So yes, grief and loss comes in all versions and varieties. So I do want to preface the talk about death, sharing a little bit about my experience. So this is my husband's funeral. He passed away unexpectedly in June of 2017. He died from a pulmonary embolism that was an unexpected complication from a successful prostate cancer surgery. Now, my husband was the leader of a Christian motorcycle club called Brotherhood, so his funeral was the largest motorcycle funeral ever to be held in Australia. Cold comfort, really. So his death clearly was a huge shattering event in my life. There's a song from the movie Ghost that talks, the song says, when you died, you took my day with you. You took my night with you. You took my world with you. And I thought that captured what happened for me because it meant catastrophic life change. Motorcycle ministry is not really a thing for a single woman, though it had been part of my life. For 40 years we'd been together. So Greg passed away. We had his funeral. The day after his funeral, my daughter miscarried. First granddaughter, we had to go back to the same hospital where Greg had passed away, back to emergency where I'd taken him in. Greg didn't know that Gemma was pregnant. The test results had only kind of come in all at that time. So that was a tragedy at the same hospital. Then about a month after that, I managed to go back to work. And in the first few weeks back at work, the hospital called me to say that they were conducting an investigation into Greg's death because there had been error, there'd been failings on their behalf, and Greg actually didn't need to die. So that was very difficult to actually come to terms with that, and that resulted in a very long process, and a root cause analysis investigation, a HCCC, Healthcare Complaints Commission got involved, a very big process. About that same week, Robin, who works in my practice, had to leave because she had to have her leg amputated. She has Raynaud's, and it was becoming septic. On the same day, one of the other girls who works with me found out she had breast cancer, so she had to go in for radical urgent surgery to have her breast removed. A couple of weeks after that, I went out to the cemetery to visit my husband's grave, and it had been accidentally dug up. Now, the cemetery said they would never do that because that's a crime, but it was dug up. So that was a very long process of getting that fixed. His headstone was removed and reseated 5 times. On the first anniversary of his death, his grave was finally laid to rest. It was finally complete. On the first anniversary of Greg's death, Westmead Hospital, it's okay if you know who they are, they had conducted a lot of research because of Greg's death, and they had established the trial of the first pulmonary embolism response team in the Southern Hemisphere, the only one in Australia, the only one in the Southern Hemisphere. They rolled out this trial. They wanted to start on the first anniversary of Greg's death, and it rolled out to the second anniversary. In that 12 months, they said that this protocol saved 27 lives, which is wonderful and also cold comfort, because why couldn't my husband be one of those 27 lives? That'd be nice. At the 1.5 years, at the first anniversary, my first granddaughter was born, Ruby. 6 months later, my first grandson was born, and he was born with meningitis. And he was also in Westmead Hospital in ICU, touch and go whether or not he'd live. And he was in ICU for 2 weeks, but he survived, and he's a robust, wonderful little boy. 4 weeks after Joshua was born with meningitis, my brother died unexpectedly from a heart attack. So it's been a journey, and grief happens to all of us. Why does this happen? Why is not the right question. It's how do we walk with God, with whatever he brings to our day. I had a client say to me that she was so glad, she felt so blessed that my husband had died because her son was tragically drowned on the Central Coast 6 months after Greg's death. So we've journeyed our grief and loss together. But I can see that 2 Corinthians comes alive, that the comfort that we receive from God, we can pass that on to other people. Death is inevitable. Grief and loss is going to happen to all of us. How do we stand firm when this is happening? So that's a little bit about me. My last couple of years have been fun. It's been a challenge. And at times it shakes our sense of where is God in all of this? Where is God in all of this? You know where he is? He's right here. You know, it's not that he stands beside me. In all of the grief and the loss and the tears and the crying out to God, I can say that I have felt held by him. Even on those days when I don't know where he is and I can't find him, I still have this overriding sense that I'm being held by him in this journey. So let's have a think then. What are some of the things that grief can do to us? I'll say this briefly so that if anyone here has experienced some grief stuff, just so you know it's normal. And also, if you're talking to somebody else who's dealt with some grief stuff, you can let them know it's normal. So physically, I would be asking you, but I'm not going to because I don't want your germs. So we can have all sorts of things. We can have migraines, we can get nauseous, we can vomit, we can end up with ulcers, we can have pain, we can have neck pain, back pain, we can grind our teeth, bruxism, we can have all sorts of physical reactions. At the end of my husband's funeral, and there was almost 2,000 people there, but it was just a blur for me. At the end of his funeral, whenever it was finally over and we could go to the car, I walked out the doors of the function centre and my whole body locked up in pain. It just locked and I couldn't walk and I couldn't move. And so family who were with me was, could you walk to the car? I can't walk, I can't move, I can't fit. The pain was excruciating. So they had to drive the car right to the gutter and shuffle me in, and I just ached. I ached for hours and hours. And that's normal, that's okay. And I also cried. I would sit on the bathroom floor and cry. One time I felt like the tiles were sucking my body into the tiles, sinking into the floor as I was saying, I can't do this. I can't do it. And then I said, no, I don't want to do it, but I know that I can do it because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And you know what? I felt him lifting me up out of the tiles. I know that all sounds pretty weird, but that was my experience of hanging on to hope. So physically, all sorts of things can happen to us. Emotionally, we can cry, we wail, people can get angry, people despair, we question. There's a whole roller coaster. Some people, when we had family, my kids, we have 5 children, they all gathered for a month. We all lived together for a month after Greg's death. And we had these moments of just hysterical laughter and then just tears and tears. I remember one night I wasn't coping and my girl said, Mum, why don't we take you to see Wonder Woman at the movies? And I was, okay, we'll go to Wonder Woman. And sat there, I know nothing about that movie, but I just wanted to be there knowing that these girls were trying to support me and just love me. So psychologically, we can do also, behaviourally. Behaviourally, we have to be careful because some people might self-medicate and they might drink too much or smoke too much. They might self-harm, they might gamble. Sometimes we can do things, we can over-exercise, we can just run because we're trying to avoid. So sometimes our behaviours might seem a little bit strange, and psychologically, it can be a bit of a roller coaster. Grief and depression are not the same. So there's only been a few moments in my 3 and a bit years where I've actually experienced depression. It's very different to grief, but sometimes grief can trigger some depression. Grief is this despair and yearning and loss and sadness and I can't go forward and what's the purpose and meaning and I just want my husband, I just want to hold him and talk to him. Depression is what's the point of anything? I feel nothing. There's no meaning to keep going. I feel helpless, hopeless, pointless, worthless. They're different. And so when you slip into that depressed state, that's when we really need to do something to shift out of that because that's not grief, but sometimes grief can trigger depression for us. So the other thing, talking psychologically, and I think this is helpful to understand, each one of us is born with about 100 billion neurons, cells in our brain cells. Now, the way we grow, God's design is so amazing. The way brains develop is the neurons connect. So these spidery little cables connect all the brain cells. And that's how our thinking patterns and our behavioural patterns, our brain wires up so we can think and talk and learn, drive a car, do everything that we do. The thing that happens in the front of our brain, it's where empathy lives. It's where we connect. We've got these little cortical stacks here. And it's like invisible dendrites, is what they're called. These invisible cables go out between us and other people. And that's how we build connection. And there's hormones like oxytocin that are part of that. But we actually have in real time and place physical cables that actually are dedicated. So I have cables in my brain that were dedicated to Greg. They started in my head and they ended in his. You know that sense of we finish sentences for each other, we know what the other person thinks, something happens, that's the person I want to talk to, we're automatically, there they are. Now, the problem that happens when somebody dies, it's like those circuits are just cut. And so I know I've experienced, and I have read about it, I experienced this white noise. I experienced this fog in the front of my brain. And I can remember some days hitting my head saying, I just want my brain to work again. Now, I know that it's because those dendritic pathways that were dedicated to Greg are now ending in a black hole. I know that, but that didn't make me feel any better, nor did it make my brain work. What happens is those little cables, God's design is clever, they just get rerouted to other neurons. So that memory will never go. Our brain's additive, not subtractive. So I'll never lose that connection. But the potency and strength of it over time is going to diminish. So it's not going to cause me so much shock and distress. So I'll still have that connection, but my brain started working. An example that it wasn't working well. Driving when we were first, after the funeral, going to look at the cemetery, one of the first times. And I was driving in the car and I just started crying and I said to myself, I can't do this. I can't do this. So I took my hands off the steering wheel. My foot was still on the accelerator and the kids are going, Mum, stop the car. And I went, like, right now? Yes, stop right now. So I said, okay, I'll stop. Mum, just put it in park, get out of the car. Okay, good idea. So, and I knew what I was doing, but it didn't seem like a problem. I wouldn't do that now, trust me. You're safe to drive home on the roads with me. But brains can have that fog because these cables, it's electrical. There's electricity and it kind of, it's like white noise. And I understand what that feels like from the inside out. And it doesn't mean that we're crazy. It makes sense. Does it make sense? If we've lost some of that connection, then our brain's going to be, well, where's that energy going? Because that person isn't there and you're not going to get the reply that you want. So here's the thing. I've got a slide I want to show you. Grief is incredibly unique. There isn't one way of grieving. Everybody's going to find their own way. And so we're going to work out whatever it is that we need to do. So I think that's important. There's no typical response. There's no normal way of grieving. No matter what book you read, what textbooks you read, what doctors you talk to, psychologists included, you're going to find your own way. And it's going to be unique, and that's okay. One size fits one. In all of this, so this is what our responses can be to grief. What's God's response? When I was going through this in its acute phase, as in 3 years, I felt like I called it the drowning place. I just had this sense of, it's weird, being held by God but falling, just constantly falling. And then I stumbled across this picture that just captures what God's reaction was to me. That in that drowning place, he was just reaching in, and I think it was Peter walking on the water sinking, help me. And that just captured it. That was my journey. God reached into my despair. He noticed he was right there. So I found that picture really encouraging, and I'm going to get it printed on a canvas and put it up in my house because God saved me. In my drowning place, he reached in and he saved me. And that's what he does for all of us, for each one of us. He never abandons us. He never forsakes us. I looked up this painting to see how much it would cost to buy. I don't know if anyone's seen it before. I looked it up. It's thousands and thousands of dollars. So I'm just going to secretly put it on a canvas and put it in my bedroom. And that's not illegal because no one else will see it. Okay, the other problem with grief is it wouldn't it be nice, well not nice, but if we just had one grief that we had to deal with. Now, my story, as well as all of those things that happened, I still had to sort out all the finances. I had to organise the funeral and pay for the funeral. I had to close up Greg's credit card. He also was producing a motorcycle TV series, and he was halfway through the last episode. So I had to now negotiate with the camera crew and Channel 7. We had no money, so I had to do a GoFundMe to pay for the money to finish. So there's so many things that happen when somebody dies. We do not have the luxury of, we'll just deal with this one thing. And the textbooks all say, don't move house. Well, we lived in a church house and they had other plans for the house. They delayed telling us because Greg died, but within 6 months I had to move and I didn't have a choice. And so it would have been nice to stay put, but life just doesn't work that way. So we have to deal with each day as it comes. So the context, it all depends on relationships and age and all of the other grief events. The legal challenges, sometimes there can be big issues around the will where families want to contest the will and families all racing because they want to steal bits and pieces. So are we connected? Are we isolated? How's my health anyway? How's my mental health? So all of these other factors impact on what's happening with grief. So we've got to keep that in mind. It isn't just dealing with the death of a child. It isn't just dealing with the death of your partner. That's just the beginning of this cascading tsunami of grief and loss issues that we have to keep on dealing with because we don't have a choice. So I looked at, because I've run many grief seminars in my career, so I looked at some of the models that I have encouraged other people to look at, and I realised how, they don't really work very well. Well, not for me. So these are the most typical ones that you're going to see, or that you'll read about, or that other people are going to talk to you about. So the first one is the task-based model of grief, and it's the initials TEAR, TEAR. And this model talks about helping people work out, the tasks. They've got to accept the reality of the loss. You just have to come to terms with the fact that your husband's not coming back and that his body's going to slowly decay in that coffin under the ground. I don't know. That's pretty hard to come to terms with that. And then we have to experience the pain and the loss. Well, that's easy. Going there, not a problem. And then to look at adjusting to my new environment without the lost person. Making new friends and doing new activities and picking up hobbies. It's just not that easy. I don't know that my life will ever completely be level again. And that's okay. That's okay. God loves broken people. He loves us. And then reinvest in the new reality. Doesn't that sound like cold and clinical? That's just not my experience. That might be somebody wanting to write a bit of a theory 10 years later about what happened 10 years ago. But there was zero comfort in that for me. And I talked to people about that before myself. I didn't find that helpful at all. I see some of you are writing things down. I'm actually really happy if anyone wants a copy of the PowerPoint minus the pictures. You don't get that Jesus reaching into the water picture because you might sue me. But if anyone wants a copy of it, Margaret, I'm dobbing you in now. You're really happy to pass that on, email it if anybody wants it. You don't have to have it, but if you think it might be helpful, you can. The next one is the dual processing model. Now this model, I think is a little bit better, where I'm in this functioning place. Yay, I'm going really well. And then I'm in this collapsed place and I'm not coping. So I'm in the loss orientation or the restoration orientation. The problem was for me that in my journey, rather than going backwards and forwards, I found that I was just in the same place. I was having to get on with life, but Greg's loss was with me every single day. I think it took till 3 years that I had a day when I didn't think about him. And so that's a long road where there wasn't some reference point in my day about my husband not being here. So, and that's okay. That's okay. So for me, it was both and, not either or, and that's okay. I can feel pretty lousy and lost, but still function and have people over for dinner and go to church and do my job and, still function. But, when will it ever be okay in my life that my husband died? When am I ever going to say, doesn't bother me, I'm so over that, not an issue. 35 years ago, we had a little stillborn daughter. She died 8 months in utero. So I had to deliver my first daughter, a tiny little possum, perfectly formed, except that she had passed away in utero. So we had her cremated and we kept her ashes because I couldn't just throw her away somewhere. That wouldn't be helpful. So instead, she was buried with her daddy. Now, the cemetery said if I wanted her name on the headstone, I had to pay an extra $1,000-something. So we just said, no, she's in the arms of her daddy and going to be with her big daddy, so we know where she is and that's okay. Why do I mention that? Because it's almost 4 decades ago. Will I ever get to a point in my life where I can say, it doesn't bother me that she died, I'm over that, not a biggie. What was Rebecca who? What? Was she a girl or a boy? No, that doesn't mean that anything's wrong. If we've loved someone and we're invested in them, we're still going to hold that. It's still going to be important. We're going to still cherish that. Sometimes, if I now talked to you about my journey with Rebecca, I would end up crying. Not because I'm not over it, but because I loved her. I only ever had, we won't talk about it because I'll cry, I only ever had experience of her little body in my belly and a little bum sticking out and little elbows. And they're precious memories. I remember her pregnancy probably clearer than my other children because they're the only memories I have of her. So this one, the dual process, I think we can have both. We can struggle and be okay until we slowly move out of that foggy space. And like I said, it's taken me about 3 years, and maybe I'm not completely out of the woods yet, and that's okay. That's okay. This guy, Nehemiah, is probably one of the better-known grief therapists at the moment. He was in Australia earlier this year, and I was going down to a conference in Melbourne with him, but of course everything got cancelled, and he didn't come over, and so none of that happened. But he talks about how what we're trying to do is we're just trying to make sense of. We're trying to find meaning in life. Now, lots of people will talk about we just need to understand why it's happening, and then we'll cope better. Now, I do agree with some of that. How do we find resilience and post-traumatic growth and become better people? Because the formula for how do we get resilience when some sort of tragedy happens, we have to develop our coping skills. Those coping skills then lead to resilience. What is resilience really? It's wisdom. So now I have wisdom of how to deal with difficulty and trauma. So next time a version of trauma comes, I've got a little bit of a wisdom to give me a head start on how to deal with this next particular trauma or tragedy that's happening. So I do agree some of it's about finding meaning and making sense. But, and as we tell our story, we rebuild our bond with the loved one, we reinvent our lives, it's all really clinical. The other thing that I thought sometimes the only sense we can make of tragedy is that we just don't understand it. You know, you look at the stories, I pulled 3 J's out. Think of Joseph in the Old Testament, think of Job in the Old Testament, think of Jesus. You know, for the people around them, it was really hard to make any sense of what was going on, except that God's sovereign, except that we can rest cradled in his arms, knowing that he's got it. And I will probably never really get it, because by the time we get to heaven, we just might not want to get it. Need to get it. I think we can spend a lot of time anguishing over why and how come this happened to me and not them. Why did I have those 3 years of just felt like every day was another smashing. And a few times it was, God, I don't know if I could do much more. But you know what? With his help, I did. And I think it's resting in him. That's the meaning that I find, not finding some existential join the dots and, well, if Greg didn't die, we wouldn't have that pulmonary embolism response protocol in Australia. So it's good that he died because his death has meant all these other people can live. I don't think that answers it for me. I don't think that's good enough for me. I think it's a blessed outcome, but that definitely doesn't cut that for me, except this was part of God's journey. That makes more sense for me, not human stuff. Okay, so what I thought was, the model that I like the very best is this model, where grief has kind of a beginning, and it has kind of a middle, and it has kind of an end, and we go backwards and forwards. How did I think about that? Well, I thought, what is the most profound death in all of history? What can that death teach me for Forget all my uni studies and psych stuff. What can that death teach me about how I can journey in this valley of the shadow of death? What can that teach me? So, of course, I'm talking about Jesus. So in this, the beginning phase, that's like Friday. That's like Good Friday, Black Friday. The beginning, for me, was like this sudden shattering of life. It's not expected. This shouldn't have happened. Greg and I had plans for the future. We were going to be grandparents and we were going to retire and we were going to live up the coast. He wanted to live in Bathurst. That was never going to happen. Live up the coast. We had all of these things that should have been happening, and then out of the blue, unexpectedly, gone. Good Friday is the day that dreams die. And it just doesn't make any sense. When Jesus died, for all of his disciples, for all of the people, it just made no sense. People didn't get it. And that's how I felt. And it was a shattering. So the beginning is where we're confronted with it. Then we come to the middle phase. The middle phase is like Saturday, Black Saturday it's been called. Saturday is when the initial shock wears off a little bit. Now we just get to feel the wretched, despairing, bone-shattering, blood-curdling pain. We get to feel the rush of all the negative emotion. We come to terms with this. We feel the loss. We yearn for the person who's gone. I can remember walking around my house with like every cell in my body was yearning to see Greg, to hold him, to talk to him. It was so strong I couldn't even sit still. It was like I was searching for him. I wasn't searching for him. I knew he was dead. But this overwhelming yearning was so distressing. Now, the thing with Saturday is nobody knew that Sunday was coming. Nobody actually knew that Resurrection Sunday was coming. The other thing with Saturday is we don't know how long it's going to last. I didn't know how long my Saturday was going to last. I didn't think it would be more than 2 years of being in that place. And it's not all grief and pain. There is living life and connecting with people. But it was a long road. Somebody gave me a verse in Isaiah. They thought it was a really encouraging passage, a few pages on, and talked about how Isaiah 40, that God gives strength to the weary, and the end of it says that if we hope in the Lord, we're going to renew our strength. We'll soar on wings like eagles, run and not grow weary, walk and not be faint. It was the most discouraging Bible verse I'd ever been given. And I thought, walk and not faint. Sometimes I found it really hard to stand up. Sometimes I just needed to I just so fatigued. Grief makes you really tired. You get really fatigued and lose energy. And I thought, soar on wings like eagles, I can't even get up out of the chair and walk to the couch. So after a while, after a few months had gone by, I realised, I reread this verse because it was in a card, and went, oh, I can walk and not be faint. And not faint. I actually can run. I think I'm starting to run. It was like I had these little chubby eagle legs and I was just starting to run. I wasn't ready to soar. I was flapping a bit. Ask my kids, they think I flap all the time. But I was just starting to get some energy back. It's only been at the 3-year mark that I can say I think I've done a few little flights. So it's taken a while. So that verse is one of the best verses I've ever been given. But at the time, I think someone was just meaning really well, but I just wasn't at that place. I wasn't anywhere near that place. But 3 years on, I am. So, and then comes the end. And the end phase is when we're soaring on wings like eagles. So even that verse, I think that speaks to it as well. So in the end, Jesus, there's new beginnings. So at the very beginning of this talk, on the heading, it says change equals loss equals grief. That's kind of a nice little clinical formula. It's very popular. Psychologists and bereavement therapists like that equation, change equals loss equals grief. I actually like If we think about 2 Corinthians, if anyone's in Christ, he's a new creature. The old has gone and the new has come. I like the passage in Isaiah that says, forget the former things. Don't dwell on the past. God's doing a new thing. Can't you see it? Like streams in the desert, it's springing up. So I find those verses encouraging, that change equals hope and possibility. Change equals new things and new beginnings. It takes time. It's definitely not quick. But it doesn't just mean grief. That's not the end. Sunday's the end. Resurrection is the end. New beginnings and hope is the end. That's the third stage, not the grief and the loss and the being destroyed. It takes time to get there. My Saturday was really long. I had a very long Saturday. And sometimes I still go back to Monday. I had a dream last week, which I haven't told anyone because it's very embarrassing. I had a dream last week that I was at a function and Greg was there and he was sitting 3 chairs down, a long table, and he's looking away from me. And I went up to him and I said, "Oh, Greg, it's so weird that we're somewhere, but we're not together." But he didn't turn around. And this other guy came up to me and said, "Colleen, don't you know he's with someone?" I went, "Oh, what?" He's with a free-spirited feminist with a bowl cut. And then I woke up. I went, "A free-spirited feminist with a bowl cut? Oh, God, why is Greg with somebody else?" Oh. But it's so interesting. When we first met, Greg said to me one of the things he loved about me was that I was free-spirited. And when I was a kid, our baby photos, my mum was one of those people who used to cut like this, and often we'd laugh at our baby photos and say, "Oh, such a bowl cut." And it was God actually, I think, reminding me of the connection. I laugh about it, but it is embarrassing to say a free-spirited feminist with a bowl cut. That's only last week. And so sometimes we're going to be triggered. Sometimes we're just going to have bad days. So Jesus paid it all. And that's the Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I like to look at it that way. So the last thing that I want to share with us is some strategies of how to move forward, things that I've found helpful in my journey. I was reading in the Old Testament, this is the cyclical stages, avoidance. I probably shouldn't say that. I think it's more confronting is a better word, or the reality of it. And then we can experience all the suffering and then integration. But it can go round and round, just like I had the dream only last week. We go backwards and forwards sometimes in our experience of the emotional roller coaster, and that's normal. There's nothing crazy about that. So some thoughts for the journey. So it's an American picture. Mileage unknown. How long is this journey? It's a long journey, and that's okay. So the passage that really spoke to me about how to deal with grief was David and Goliath in 1 Samuel, because I was trying, as a psychologist, I was working really hard to find out how to navigate this road. What's the best, healthiest way to deal with this emotional roller coaster? So I'd gone through all of those models and I was, they're not fitting for me. And so this made so much sense to me. Now, we know this story of David and Goliath. We've got Philistine army on one hill and the Israelites and Judah on the other hill, and Goliath comes out and he's like 1,000,000 feet tall and he's threatening, and all the Israelites said, "No, we can't do it," and all the Philistines said, "Yeah, we're going to beat you all." And so David, who's the shepherd, he's the youngest one, and he comes in saying, "What's going on?" "Oh, it's the Philistines and Goliath." And David says, "Oh, I'll get him. I'll take care of this." And they were, "Oh, don't be so ridiculous." And he said, "You forget. In my life, I have killed bears. I have killed lions protecting the sheep." Now, I like that because I think God says to us, we've all killed lions and killed bears. Whatever your journey is, you've climbed mountains. You've had success. So they said, "All right, we'll give you a go. But you have to put on all these models and theories and this helmet and tunic and the sword and all of the prescribed things." And David said, "Oh, I can't even move, let alone breathe or walk." So he took them all off. And he said, "I need to work out how I will fight this battle." You see, for me, grief was my Goliath. I had to work out, how do I fight this battle? So I looked at how did David fight the battle? Well, with four things. The first one was his shepherd's staff, which defines who he is. That's him, his personality. Remember, he's killed lions and bears. He knows how to fight. He's just a boy and he's just a shepherd. But he first of all had to, this is my shepherd's staff, this is who I am. This is how I approach life, this is what I bring. The second thing that he had his shepherd's pouch. And in that pouch is all of his tools and tricks of the trade, whatever shepherds need. And that's where he's got the, I've killed bears, I've killed lions. It's all in his little kit bag. We all have a kit bag. We all have it. We all have past successes. My mother's died, my father's died, my uncle suicided, a close friend suicided. You know, we all have tools. And even if we haven't experienced a death, I was supposed to go to Mount Everest base camp this year, and I got as far as Kuala Lumpur airport for 20 hours and I had to come home. So I had to learn how to cope with that disappointment. So we've all got things in our kit bag. We've all got tools that have got us through life in the past. It's not a new beginning. It's not a blank slate. The other thing that he did, the third thing, is he went to the river and he found the resources that he needed, that he didn't have. And he got 5 smooth stones. He got more than he needed because he's clever, because it's better to be more equipped than less equipped. So he went and found the pastor or the women's ministry leader or the best friend or the psychologist or the doctor. He went and found the resources that he needed because he didn't have them. So he had to get the resources. And then the fourth thing that he didn't just go home and pull the covers over. He didn't just go home and give up. He didn't go home and say God's not real. What he did, he got his slingshot out, because now he had to put it all together. He had to get his slingshot out of his shepherd's pouch. Remember his identity with the staff, he's a shepherd. He had to get the slingshot out, use the resources, and live it. Put it into practice. That's how he defeated Goliath. That's probably the most profound thing that helped me in my grief journey, was remembering who I am with God and how he loves me. I'm a child of God, daughter of the King. What are the resources that he's given me, which includes the people in my life? What are the other resources that I need? I went to see a Christian psychologist because I think psychologists are worth talking to. And then I had to put things into practice. I actually had to step up and not just curl up in a ball and give up. So I found this story of David and Goliath. I'd never thought about David and Goliath in terms of grief before, but I trowed the Bible, trying to find the things that spoke to me about how God was going to walk with me, or how I would walk with him through this tough season. So the things that I lost, it's very easy for us to get stuck on this. The other thing that God spoke to me about was remembering what I have, not what I don't have. Because if I focus on what I don't have, I'm focusing on nothing. I'm focusing on emptiness. I'm focusing on loss and despair. So I had lost. These are the things I had lost. I'd lost the presence of Greg. So he was gone. And that's difficult. It was difficult going to bed on my own. It was difficult not being able to reach out and touch him. It was difficult being with friends. The loss of that person who is so much a part of your life, and a child as well. I think long-term partner and a child, this ache of the person not being there really bites us. I also lost my place. I lost place. Who am I? I'm now a single woman. I'm a widow. I'm the person who doesn't get invited to dinner. I was very involved in outlaw motorcycle ministry. It's not really a place for a single woman. How do I make that adjustment? At Greg's funeral, the Mongols put in some collection money to help go towards the funeral. There was the Christian motorcyclist combined clubs also put some money in towards for the funeral. Like, it's very different Very different. I had people like Ferret and Animal and Skull all popping in I had the president of the Gypsy Jokers pop in, and he had tea and bickies with me and my daughter one afternoon because he wanted to pop in to see how I was going. Very different. Lovely people, but not somewhere where I would stay on my own. I don't think it's appropriate ministry for a woman on her own. So I lost my place. And that's been difficult. I thank God for my psychology career in church, because that's certainly a place. But after 40 years of having to change channels has been quite challenging. I lost my purpose. So what is the purpose? We had a future together. So, well, that's plans, but what's the purpose of it all? The things that we were achieving, the goals that we set together, the reason that we were together and what God was doing. I lost my reason for doing things. What was the point? I had to find a new point. And the plans, we had lots of plans. Lots of plans for retirement, for having all of that time together that the busyness of life seems to make really hard to work out. And so, like many of us, we look forward to our retirement years when we'll finally have time to do all of that travel or whatever it is that we want to do. But then suddenly it's gone. So none of those plans will come to fruition for me. All of those plans are lost. And I lost passion. Not just passion for my husband, not just the intimacy and the lovemaking, though that's lost as well. And coming to terms with that will probably never happen in my life again. I still feel married. I think I probably always will. But that's another big thing that we come to terms with. Losing passion for living, passion for friends. I could turn up and be pretty two-dimensional with a big smile, but some of the passion was really hard because I'd felt so wounded by life. So I lost all of these things. Now, we can go to therapy or talk to people about all the things that we've lost, but I think that'll just make us feel worse. I think we need to acknowledge them, own them, feel heard, tell the story, and then start looking at other things. And if we need to go back, let's do that, but let's not stay there. We don't need to keep retelling the story of the death and the detail of digging up the cemetery and the miscarriage and the meningitis. We don't need to keep going over those things because the miracle isn't there. The hope isn't there. The way forward isn't there. It isn't in the loss. Instead, I had to look at, okay, what do I have? What do I have? Because I'm still a citizen of heaven. And I don't know what people think, whether or not we'll be with partners in heaven or see our kids in heaven. I know what I think, but I don't need... If anyone wants to know that, I'm happy to tell you afterwards, because I think we all hang on to whatever our belief around that is. So what do I have rather than what don't I have? I have the presence of God. And that picture of Jesus reaching into the drowning place is very powerful for me. And just being able to feel his presence and his arms around me has been really very comforting. And his word has been incredibly comforting. This is probably the best book that I was given when Greg died. And it's called The Book of Hope, and it's up here if you want to... Well, but it's a journal. It's every day, day by day, when somebody dies. So I don't mind if you look at it, but don't just get stuck there reading all the comments that I've written. I don't mind if you have a look at it, though. This was an anchor. This was like a physical anchor point between me and God. So if you know somebody who's going through a loss, this is the journey of the loss of her child. And it's not the journey, it's her encouragement day by day. So I found it an incredibly supportive and powerful book. The other one that I found, which is the complete opposite, this one's, much more emotive and feeling and day to day, was Tim Keller's Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. It isn't just about grief, but a big chunk of it is. And that's very powerful and sound theology and really speaks truth. So those two books I probably found the most helpful. There's many, many, many books. I just grabbed those few off my bookshelf. So what do I have? I have God, and he's never going to abandon me. He's never going to forsake me. Nothing happens out of his knowing. None of this happened by surprise to God. He's got a plan with all of this. The number of people I have spoken to about pulmonary embolism, one of my clients went to Westmead and the pulmonary embolism response team had to assist her. My daughter, who had my first granddaughter, she now is pregnant and she got chest pain. They were pretty sure it was a blood clot. She's 7 months pregnant, so she again had to go to Westmead Hospital. But it was so comforting to know that my husband's death, if there was a crisis, would keep his daughter alive. God just works in ways we can't even conceive, because that's the only pulmonary embolism response team in Australia. And that's where she went. And we'll never know if she had a blood clot because she couldn't have a CT scan. They just gave her lots of blood thinners. But the pulmonary embolism team was activated and good to go. Now, that's the sovereignty of our God. Even though it wasn't activated, that was so comforting. That was so comforting. So what do I have? I have the presence of God, and He's never going to let us go. He's never going to abandon us. He's never going to forsake us, no matter what's happening. I also have people. Let's not forget community. We have family. We have our brothers and sisters. In Genesis, when God created everything and it was good, He made the fish and the trees and the mountains and the water and the sun and everything, and it was good. You know what the first not good that ever existed in all of creation, the very first not good in the Bible says it's not good for man to be alone. Now, that means, to have Eve, but it's actually true. We need other people to grow and develop. Our brains can't develop in isolation. They can't. They don't. We've seen kids in some of the orphanages in Eastern Europe. They die from something called marasmus, failure to thrive, because no one has interaction with them. They hardly ever get picked up. There's no communication. This reciprocity that child psychologists will talk about that helps brain development and neural development. So we need people. The first not good, it's not good to be alone. So if we know people who are struggling with loss, whether it's death or any of the other losses, they might be hard to talk to and they might be a bit grumpy or withdrawn or hard to talk to, but let's turn up. Let's stay connected. And if you're the person who's struggling with grief and loss, reach out. Be there, even if it just means you go to church and just sit, which is what I did for a long time. I just needed to be there and sit and cry a lot. The songs would make me cry, and that's okay. And I certainly didn't need people to run away from me. It was really nice that people would then just sit with me and pass me tissues, because we need to feel it's okay. So what do I have? I have people, but I need to turn up just like I need them to turn up. Yep, let's cook meals for each other. That's fantastic. But let's sit next to someone when they're crying and in despair or angry or asking questions that you can't answer. It's okay to say, yeah, I don't know. I don't know why this has happened. I don't know, because we don't know. And I also have possibilities. This is back to the 2 Corinthians. With if anyone's in Christ, he's a new creature. It's back to Isaiah. Forget the former things. Don't dwell on the past. It doesn't literally mean have a lobotomy and blank it out, because we can't do that. But instead of focusing on that, let's move forward. The other passage I like in Genesis, when Sodom and Gomorrah and the angels getting Lot and his family out of there, and the angel says, don't look back, don't look back. You can't move forward running backwards. And so what happened? Lot's wife was destroyed by looking back. So we don't want to get stuck in the past. Now that's a psychologist speaking as well, but we need to be looking forward. We honour the past, we cherish the memories. I love my husband. I'll always love him. He still feels in my heart. I still feel him in my heart. I don't feel his presence in the house. I know that he's with God, but I'll always love him. And that's okay. But I know that God has other things for me. I know there's possibility and hope and new things. And it's exciting. There's always going to be new things. We don't reach a point and God says, well, that's it, you're done. There's new things. And I have power. I have my personality. I've got my education. There's things that I can do to affect the world. I can stand up and speak up. So I actually can action things in my life. I'm not a victim and I'm not broken. I'm wounded, but I'm not destroyed. The death has absolutely, and all of the journey that went with it, has certainly left some scars. But I still have power and potency that God's given me so I can stand up and be who He's called me to be. And I have permission to grieve however I need to do that. I have permission to be me and to own my emotions and to own my journey. When Greg died, for the first year, I'm not a cemetery dweller. When my parents have passed away, I went to the cemetery once for each of them, and that was to see the headstone, and then I'd never gone back. With Greg, I went to the cemetery for the first year at least once a week, sometimes twice. We had our first Christmas, guess where? At the cemetery. We had Father's Day at the cemetery. The second year, we had morning tea for Christmas at the cemetery. And this year, if the kids want to pop in, they can. But I have probably, in the second year, I was going maybe once every few weeks. Now, this year, I've been a handful of times. Even I think that's weird. Well, no, I didn't. I just figured if I need to do that, then I need to do that, and that's okay. So, and if I never went to the cemetery, like with my parents, that's okay. And so we need to give ourselves permission that whatever it is that's going to help us in the journey, that's all right. Let's take that step. So these two Bible verses, they might be hard to read. But basically what they're saying is that when we go through tough stuff, God's growing us. You know how God disciplines people that He loves? Discipline actually means like going to the gym and training. And so it's through some of these experiences that we learn perseverance. We develop our character. So we're not two-dimensional Christians. We become rich Christians, rich in wisdom, rich in knowing that Christ sustains us. So, and we have hope that there's a future and that God's working this out. I've felt so despairing these last few years and so close to God in this journey at the same time. And so we rejoice, rejoice even though we're suffering grief in all sorts of grief in all sorts of trials. We still know that this is part of God training us up. So we need to lean into Him, not lean away from Him. Then we come to the final representation of what grief looks like. I really like this. So the expectation is, here's me before any particular loss, and then a grief happens. Bang! And now everything is around this grief. And kind of waiting for it to shrink. Just waiting for the grief to subside so I can kind of get back to normal. That's not what happens. God's given us brains that are additive, not subtractive. So what happens is, here's reality before the grief. Grief hits, bang! Greg's death will always be that big. But what happens is I mature. I grow. I get bigger around that grief. I develop wisdom and knowledge and character and perseverance and godliness. So now I can hold that grief. So that's what grief does for us if we let it. It helps us to mature, to become better people. You know, maybe a checkerboard of scars, but it means we can stand with other people when they're going through tough stuff. We can understand, we can share the comfort that we've had. It's really hard to share that comfort. We can be empathic and understanding. It's hard when we haven't had some of that journey. But 2 Corinthians is really clear. We can share some of that comfort from how we've been comforted. And what I think it's like is like the that little graphic's not there, that's all right. The formation of a pearl. So a pearl happens when there's something that shouldn't be inside the oyster. It's an irritation that's put inside the oyster. It shouldn't be there. It shouldn't have happened. It wasn't in the plan. It's not in the run sheet. But suddenly there's something that's put in. And so the pearl has to develop a way to manage that. And so it grows around and creates something beautiful. So this saying, a pearl is a beautiful thing that is produced by an injured life. It is the tear from the injury of the oyster. The treasure of our being in this world is also produced by an injured life. If we had not been wounded, if we had not been injured, then we will not produce the pearl. So I think there's richness and growth and knowledge, even though there's scars as well. I think that is part of the journey as we grow around the grief. And these passages, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted, saves those who are crushed in spirit. That was a bit of a mantra for me for the first few months. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And I remember crying out to God for that to hurry up and happen. And it's happening because he's good and faithful and he doesn't forget us. That's where I want to finish. So if there are any questions, I'm not sure how, are we allowed to ask a question and see if we can hear each other without shouting?
See how we go.
So we'll all just listen really hard, but you can't project.
I think Nathan's definitely getting a microphone together.
And if there's no questions or comments, that's okay. If everyone just wants to go and get their water and packet of shapes. Sorry.
Can you just tell us the books?
Yes. Well, please come up and have a look. Timothy Keller, who wrote Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. The first part of it compares different religions. You can skip that part of the book. Just go to the third part. If you're someone who's struggling with grief, just go to part 3, because that really is an encouraging, supportive part of the book. The first part's interesting, they're certainly interesting, but if you're just needing some of that support, part 3, and you can come back to it later. A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis is just raw, and this, don't tell me that there's good going to come out of this, don't tell me God had a plan. It's a while since I've read it, but I like that he's being quite vulnerable with his experience of what it was like to lose his wife. And there was nothing pretty in that. And it's really hard when people try and give you glossy little reframes. God knows what he's doing. At least she's out of her suffering. If the child dies, you can have another one. You're still young. All of those clunky things. When Rebecca died, people had said that to us. I don't want that other child. I want this one. So I like that he's really real. This one, Coping with Grief, is not a Christian book. It's probably the book I've given out the most to clients. It's written by Australian authors, and it just goes through what to expect in the first 6, 8, 12 months of grief. And it talks about the second wave of grief can often come at around the 6-month mark. So some people can experience a death, and after a few months, the death, and everyone's all visiting and cooking meals and everyone's involved, and there's all the taking care of the will and probate and all those things, and then everyone else goes back to their normal life. I remember maybe 6 months in, I turned up at church and someone came up to me and said, "Oh, Colleen, you don't look very happy today. Is everything okay?" And I said, "Oh, I think it's just because my husband died." "Oh, that's right. Sorry, I forgot." So they weren't being mean, but, everyone has their own life. And so that can be quite jarring for us as well. This book talks about some of that sort of stuff. And at about the 6-month mark, we kind of have this second wave. It's almost like we've had our energy to endure, waiting for it to be over. So then we can get on with life, but then instead, just the reality can come crashing in. That's normal. Some people talk about grief like it's waves that hit us, and the waves slowly recede and they reduce in intensity. But it can feel like that suddenly I'm hit by a wave and it's a dumper and I'm churning around in the sand and I don't know which way is up. That's more at the very beginning of grief, but then that will slowly change. So that one, I probably give that one out the most. This one on death, a riveting title. Tim Keller did a funeral for a friend and they asked him if they would write up the sermon. So it's a personal and moving story sermon. So these ones I've grabbed because These two, very, very helpful for me. Doesn't mean they'll be helpful for anybody else. There is an enormous range of books out there on grief, but I found these ones to be very useful.
So Stephen's got the microphone, so...
Any questions? One thing we haven't talked about is helping kids to understand grief. So it's quite difficult for adults to come to terms with when somebody's died. So for kids, they can ask over and over and over again, where's Nana, where's Grandpa, where's Mum? It takes them quite a while. They're in heaven, when are they coming back? Can I go to heaven too? So we just need to be short, simple, factual information. It's good for kids to go to funerals. It's good for them to be part of it, rather than cocooned and cotton-balled as we do in the West. Death is part of life, and it will help them psychologically to adjust to the loss. One of the other things that caught me after Greg died, I hadn't expected the guilt. That really caught me off guard, the guilt and the remorse. And I've had a few clients now that I've shared that, all tell the same story. But obviously it's a bit taboo because I felt really bad. I hadn't expected it. And it was things like, I wish I didn't complain that he left his stuff lying around all the time, because I'd give anything if his stuff was lying around again. And really, was it worth arguments about dumb stuff? So some of those things kept flooding in, times when I was annoyed with things he'd done, times when we just were grumpy with each other. Yeah, that I did lots of... I don't think this is true, but it helped me. I thought, now, I can pray to God and God hears me. Greg's with God. So if I pray to God, he can pass the message on to Greg. This is not theologically sound, so I'm not saying this works, okay? But for me, I would pray, God, please tell Greg I'm really sorry for the times I grumbled at him. Thank you. And then I'll trust you, whatever you do with that, God. I don't really think, well, who knows? Who knows? Any other comments, questions? Yes. No shouting.
Can you talk a little bit about how it's, or what is helpful for a friend or other people around you? What was helpful to you?
I think to not feel forgotten, to not feel like you were a burden. I think just to touch base with people, and not just how you're going with the grief, but gosh, your garden's looking good. Do you want to catch up for lunch? Just to plug in some normal, and then that gives space for the person if they want to talk about anything that's happening for them. I think to be really mindful that around the 8 weeks is when pretty well everyone else is back to their own lives. And it's probably a bit quicker now because people haven't been allowed to go to funerals. There's a lot of people who've died alone, and a lot of funerals this year that there's only been a few people at. But staying connected, even if it's just texting, and people might not want to talk to you, but to be with them. I found it really helpful, just people being. Didn't need to talk because sometimes I couldn't put sentences together. And I'm not talking about the first few days, I'm talking about months. So just being there. Cook a meal, but the meals, that'll dry, all that stuff, it all dries up. So we need to actually make the effort to be there. And if they want to talk, then talk, but not make suggestions of, don't you think you should take the photos down now? Or don't you think you should put some photos up? Like, none of that. It's completely individual. So, and not just, I'm here to support you in your grief, but rather, do you want to go to the movies? Well, I don't know if they're open, but so it's just being there and being with someone. And grief therapy is really slow. So there is no clever thing that you can say. So just being with and having gentle conversations I think that's the most important thing, being present with people. And it's also not particularly helpful to just throw cliche Bible verses, because it can be a bit trite, which is how I felt. Another thought, when Greg died, my lounge room and living area was like a florist shop, which was lovely, sort of. So I vowed I would never send flowers to anyone when there's a death, because then guess what they do? They all die. They all die. And not only are they all dying, because I had to put them out because people spend a lot of money, but that smell of dying flowers, it's got a real dying smell. And then throw out the dead ones and rearrange. And so I thought, no. So I give pot plants if somebody dies, because I found that, again, a surprise. I found that really confronting.